There comes a moment in every journey when fatigue screams louder than purpose, when results feel distant and excuses feel justified. This is the exact moment where dreams either die or are reborn through persistence. Napoleon Hill, the man who decoded success itself, made it painfully clear: the only people who reach the summit are those who force themselves not to stop. This video is for the ones on the edge, for the fighters, for the builders, for the tired. You don't need another motivational quote. You need psychological ammunition, a weapon forged from discipline, clarity, and the brutal force of will. Because keeping going when you want to quit isn't about emotion. It's about identity. Hill wrote, "Persistence is to the character of man what carbon is to steel." And right now, your character is being tested. Every excuse, every fear, every delay is your enemy, and your mission is singular. Continue anyway. We're going beyond mindset. We're entering mental domination. You'll discover how to force action even in exhaustion, how to transmute frustration into fuel, and how to make your subconscious obey your purpose with military precision. You don't need permission to keep going. You need a standard that makes stopping unthinkable. This is the moment where everything can shift, not with hope, but with force. So lock in. You're about to learn how to persist like your life depends on it, because it does. There is a brutal truth at the foundation of every achievement story. Progress demands pain. Not the kind of pain that breaks you, but the kind that refines you. And in the world of Napoleon Hill, this pain is not a punishment, it is a test, a sacred initiation to prove whether or not you deserve the reward that lies ahead. The test does not come at the beginning when you are excited and inspired. It comes when the momentum fades, when results stall, when your emotional energy drains, and every part of you wants to stop. That is the precise moment Hill commands. Force yourself not to stop. You see, success is never secured in the moments of action. It is secured in the moments of resistance. When your body says no more, when your mind screams, "What's the point?" and yet you move anyway. That act, that motion in defiance of exhaustion, is not just movement, it is identity. It is self-command in its purest form. And Hill defines this capacity with one word: persistence. Persistence, he teaches, is not talent. It is not enthusiasm. It is willpower under pressure. It is the spiritual armor you wear when the world offers you 1,000 reasons to retreat. And it is built through repetition, through the decision made daily that you will not negotiate with fatigue. You will not surrender to delay. You will not pause for permission. This is not about becoming a machine. It is about becoming someone who finishes what they start. Hill studied hundreds of the most powerful men of his era, from Carnegie to Ford to Edison, and he found a common thread. Each one possessed a bulldog determination to continue, even when the world said, "Stop." This was not always pretty, it was not always poetic, but it was relentless. And that, Hill argues, is the most underrated virtue in the entire success equation. People quit not because they lack the goal, but because they lack the habit of continuation. They've trained their nervous system to stop when results don't come fast enough. But Hill flips that standard. He says, you must train yourself to expect resistance and push regardless. That's what separates the dreamer from the producer. But what about motivation? Hill makes it clear. Motivation is fleeting. It is unreliable. It is emotional. You must replace it with decision that has been cemented through your definite major purpose. When you are clear on why you began, when that purpose is tied to identity, legacy, and vision, then stopping becomes betrayal, not just of the goal, but of the self. This is where internal power begins, when your actions are no longer powered by feelings, but by standards. And standards, Hill insists, are maintained through self-discipline reinforced daily. That's why the repetition of your affirmations, your visualizations, your rituals is not optional. It's strategic. It's how you build inner immunity to mental fatigue. Let's be honest, you will get tired, you will feel resistance, you will want to quit. That's not failure, that's friction. And friction is where you prove your identity, not by pretending it's easy, but by acting powerfully. In spite of the difficulty, the moment you keep going when it doesn't feel good is the moment you separate yourself from the masses. Most people live in a loop. Start strong, slow down, give up. Hill teaches you to live in a new loop. Start, face resistance, act anyway, repeat. That becomes your power. That becomes your identity. And once your identity is forged through the fire of fatigue, you no longer fear hard days. You welcome them, because they are your opportunity to reinforce the version of you who is unstoppable. And this is exactly why you must decide today, not just to continue, but to never again identify as someone who quits. To say to yourself, from this moment forward, I will not be led by my mood. I will be led by my mission. That shift changes everything. You don't need to feel inspired every day. You need to act in alignment with your purpose every day. And as you do, day by day, your mind begins to adapt. Your subconscious begins to respond. And what once felt hard becomes normal. What once drained you begins to energize you. Because now every action is proof that you are the kind of person who moves, especially when it's difficult. If you've made it this far in this message, I want you to do two things right now. First, take a breath, not to pause, but to anchor, to remember this fire you're feeling, to turn it into fuel. And second, if this message is already resonating, if it's igniting something in your gut, click like and subscribe now, not because it helps the algorithm, but because it commits you. It says, I'm in. It says, I choose to finish, because ultimately the decision to persist is not about noise. It is not about emotion. It is about who you decide to be under pressure. Napoleon Hill made it clear, the majority of men meet with failure because of their lack of persistence in creating new plans to take the place of those which fail. That means you don't stop, you adjust, you evolve, but you continue. You must train your nervous system, your subconscious, your very physiology to obey one law. We keep going. Always. Even when it hurts. Even when no one sees. Even when the results are delayed. Because you don't act for applause. You act from alignment, and that kind of action cannot be stopped. And when the body begins to obey that internal law, when motion becomes non-negotiable, when hesitation dissolves into habit, you enter a state that Napoleon Hill describes not as ordinary persistence, but as organized effort directed with unwavering intent. This is not the same as working hard. It is working deliberately, with clarity, with emotional force, with spiritual discipline, and most importantly, with the refusal to entertain the possibility of failure. Not because failure isn't real, but because quitting is no longer on the table. Hill was obsessed with this principle because he understood something most never, that the mind, when left unsupervised, will always seek comfort. It will choose the easier path, the softer option, the excuse that sounds reasonable. But when you train your mind through consistent, courageous action, it begins to accept a new standard. That standard becomes your new baseline. It becomes who you are, not in theory, but in physiology. This is the depth most people never reach. They take action when they feel good, when momentum is high, when the path is clear. But the moment fatigue sets in, when the results don't arrive fast enough, when discomfort increases, when uncertainty takes hold, they stop. Not always permanently, but long enough to lose their momentum, their rhythm, their self-trust. And that, Hill warns, is the true cost of inconsistency. Not just the delay in results, but the erosion of identity. When you stop in the middle of the process, even with the best rationalizations, your subconscious records that act as a vote against your purpose. And over time, enough of those votes accumulate into a new belief. Maybe I'm not the kind of person who finishes. That belief is subtle, but corrosive. It infects your thoughts, your posture, your decisions, and eventually it becomes your story. But the inverse is also true. When you continue in the face of resistance, when you force yourself not to stop, even when you want to, you send a different message. This is who I am now. And that message, repeated through consistent action, becomes a fortress of belief. A foundation so strong that no setback, no failure, no delay can shake it. Because you've already decided, you've already proven, you don't need reassurance, you've earned conviction. Hill's work makes it clear. Persistence is a spiritual principle. It is not just about grit or hustle, it is about honor. The honor of keeping your word to yourself. The honor of finishing what you started, the honor of refusing to betray the version of you that dreamed boldly enough to begin in the first place. And what fuels that kind of persistence? Not hype, not adrenaline, but purpose, a vision so clear, so emotionally charged, that it becomes painful to consider stopping. That's why Hill demands clarity of purpose above all. Because when your why is strong enough, the how becomes flexible. You adjust your tactics, you evolve your methods, but your motion never ceases. Your direction remains sacred. This is the difference between those who try and those who transform. The ones who try treat persistence as optional. The ones who transform treat it as law. And once you reach this point, where motion becomes default and stopping becomes unacceptable, you become immune to failure. Not because you won't face it, but because you've already decided to outlast it. This is what Hill calls faith in action. Not hope, not optimism, but movement powered by certainty. Even if the path is unclear, even if the odds are stacked, even if your emotions fluctuate, you move. Not from pressure, from principle, from the principle that your mission is bigger than your feelings, your fatigue, or your fears. And this is where your environment begins to change. People notice, circumstances shift, opportunities appear, not because the world suddenly favors you, but because your energy now commands results. You are no longer sending mixed signals, you are consistent. And the world, as Hill taught, always responds to consistency backed by belief. So ask yourself, what if you never stopped? What if quitting simply wasn't an option anymore? How different would your results look? How different would your identity feel? What would happen if for the next 90 days you did not allow yourself a single break in forward momentum? No emotional retreats. No mental vacations, no negotiation with discomfort, only disciplined, focused, relentless movement. That is the challenge. That is the gift. Because in that process, you don't just build results, you build yourself. You become the kind of person who finishes, who follows through, who outlasts the friction, the fatigue, the fear. And that person is dangerous. That person doesn't hope for greatness, they command it. This is what it means to live the philosophy of Napoleon Hill, to become a force so internally structured that no external obstacle holds power. To become someone whose word is law, whose standards are unshakable, whose pace is unwavering. Because that kind of persistence cannot be taught. It must be lived. And now, you know how. You know what it feels like. You've tasted the power that comes from continued motion, from relentless execution, from never stopping. So make the decision now, not to try harder, but to never again allow quitting to be an option, to reframe fatigue as feedback, to treat resistance as refinement, and to finish, always finish what you start. And once you truly commit to finishing what you start, once that becomes your internal law and not just a motivational phrase, a transformation begins to occur, not only in how you act, but in how you interpret reality. Because now, every obstacle is no longer a threat, it's a mirror. It reflects back to you the depth of your persistence. Every delay is no longer a reason to stop. It becomes a test you're already prepared to pass. You see, Napoleon Hill never promised ease. What he offered instead was power, the kind of power that is earned only by those who move in spite of resistance. Hill calls this power definiteness of decision backed by persistence. It is the combination of clarity and repetition that breaks down the walls between you and your goal. Not with speed, with certainty. And certainty, once internalized, doesn't need external proof to sustain it. This is the ultimate test of character. Can you continue when your environment gives you no encouragement, no validation, and no results yet? Can you keep building, knowing the reward has already been earned, even if it hasn't yet arrived? This is what separates the few from the many. Most people act based on feedback. If results are quick, they feel good and they keep going. If resistance shows up, they stop, reevaluate, retreat. But Hill's philosophy inverts that logic. He teaches that true creators act independently of circumstance. They are powered not by conditions, but by conviction. And that conviction, when backed by action, becomes influence. Influence over your own life, your own results, and eventually your own reality. You begin to realize that what once looked like failure was never failure. It was resistance training. The universe doesn't deny you the result. It delays it long enough to see if you've built the muscle to carry it. That delay is sacred. It is the classroom where character is forged, where your nervous system is rewired for endurance, where your mind is sharpened by repetition and your emotions are stabilized by principle. But none of this works if you stop. That is the dividing line. Not intelligence, not knowledge, but movement. Relentless movement, day after day, especially when your energy is low, your belief wavers, or your faith is under fire. That's when the muscle is built. That's when the subconscious mind starts to obey. Because you've now proven that you will act regardless. Hill emphasizes that the subconscious cannot tell the difference between reality and repeated instruction, especially when charged with emotion. If you continue to act, even when nothing around you changes, your subconscious assumes success is inevitable. And once that belief is installed, your behavior begins to match it. You start to speak with more certainty, you walk with more confidence, you plan with more boldness, because you've already proven that you are not someone who gives up. And that's the identity shift that changes everything. When you act as someone who finishes, the world starts to treat you that way. People begin to take your energy seriously. Opportunities respond to your consistency. Timing begins to align with your rhythm. Not because you got lucky, but because you stayed long enough for the momentum to find you. This is the deeper magic Hill spoke of, the unseen law that governs success. He called it cosmic habit force, the invisible force that sustains what you repeatedly do. If you persist long enough, you eventually enter flow, not just the emotional state, but the life rhythm. And once you're in that rhythm, you don't need force anymore. The same effort that once drained you now energizes you, because you've become congruent. You're no longer fighting yourself, and that, above all, is what this is about. Not just doing more, but becoming whole. Becoming someone whose behavior, beliefs, and internal dialogue are in harmony. So many people live in a loop of internal conflict. They want something, but they doubt they can get it. They set goals, but they act inconsistently. They visualize outcomes, but they speak from lack. That contradiction drains their life force. It sabotages their action. It weakens their identity. But when you persist, when you continue no matter what, those contradictions begin to collapse. The version of you who acts and the version of you who dreams begin to merge. And the longer you persist in that alignment, the stronger you become, not just in results, but in soul, because at the end of the day, this is not about success. It's about integrity, about becoming someone who honors the decision to act, who respects the process, who values the inner voice of discipline more than the outer voice of doubt. That is the essence of Hill's work, self-mastery through applied will. And there is no will more powerful than the will to continue when everything tells you to quit. So keep going, not because you need to prove anything, but because you've already proven everything to yourself. Every step forward is a celebration of that decision. Every act of persistence is a reminder that you are different now. You are not hoping, you are not waiting, you are creating, and creators don't stop. When you reach the point where persistence is no longer a strategy, but a state of being, a powerful internal silence begins to replace the chaos that once filled your mind. The overthinking fades. The questioning fades, even the fear fades, not because the external world has changed, but because you've changed your relationship with action. You no longer approach your mission with negotiation, you approach it with finality. And this is when your environment begins to bend. Hill spoke often about the invisible forces that respond to definiteness, and nowhere are those forces more activated than in the presence of unshakable persistence. It is as if life itself begins to respond to the rhythm of your movement, not because of luck or timing, but because of spiritual gravity. You've now become someone who follows through, and in doing so, you've stepped into alignment with something bigger than goals. You've entered the frequency of inevitability, and yet, even here, the challenge evolves. Because once you become consistent, the temptation arises to slow down, to coast, to justify ease. But Hill warns against this trap in every one of his works. He calls it drift, that subtle, silent pull back into mediocrity. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It suggests rest that becomes routine. It rationalizes breaks that become patterns. And soon, the fire that once defined your days begins to flicker. This is why the truly persistent never stop refining their standards. They never stop asking, is this behavior aligned with who I said I'd become? That question becomes a compass. It pierces through comfort. It dissolves excuses. It realigns behavior, because the pursuit of greatness, as Hill frames it, is not a sprint. It is not even a marathon. It is a lifetime contract with discipline, and the moment you realize this, the fear of failure becomes irrelevant, because you've made peace with the only outcome that matters, showing up again and again with full force, regardless of results. You no longer worship the destination, you honor the execution. That shift makes you untouchable. Your rituals begin to reflect that. You no longer act because you're in the mood. You act because you've made a decision. That decision is protected by habits, reinforced by visualization, and fueled by a definite major purpose. These three, habit, visualization, and purpose, become your holy trinity of persistence. They are the systems that override fatigue, the weapons that slay drift, and the anchors that pull you forward when everything around you tells you to stop. And when people ask you how you keep going, your answer will no longer be intellectual. It will be experiential, because you won't speak from theory. You'll speak from embodiment. You've lived the friction. You've conquered the voice of comfort. You've faced the inner devil of laziness and outworked him. You no longer explain your success. You are the explanation. But let's pause here, because this is where I ask you the question that matters most in this journey. What are you still allowing in your life that gives you permission to stop? Is it a relationship that doesn't challenge you? A routine that doesn't demand excellence? A story you keep repeating about being tired, overwhelmed, or not ready. What is the one loophole you haven't closed that still gives you an exit door when discipline becomes uncomfortable? Hill teaches that one of the most dangerous illusions is that you can flirt with greatness and still keep the back door open. You can't. You must seal every crack, remove every escape hatch, burn every excuse, because as long as the option to quit exists in your system, even in the smallest corner of your subconscious, you are still negotiating. And as long as you negotiate, you will hesitate. And as long as you hesitate, you will never experience the full force of what you're capable of. But once you answer that question, once you identify and eliminate the hidden permission slips you've given yourself, you step into something rare. You step into full alignment. You become the kind of person Hill described not as successful, but as complete, whole, grounded, unshakable. And in that space, your work changes. It becomes cleaner, sharper, simpler. You stop wasting energy on starts and stops. You stop drowning in mental loops. You move with rhythm, and rhythm is power. Not just because it keeps you moving, but because it tells your subconscious every single day, this is who we are now. That's how you transform, not through flashes of brilliance, but through daily defiance of the urge to quit, through the simple act of saying, I will keep going, again and again, until the day the world mirrors back what you already know, that you've become someone who cannot be stopped. Once you've closed every escape route and persistence has become the only option, something remarkable begins to emerge, not from the external world, but from within. It is a state of quiet conviction, a calm force that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't even try to prove anything. It simply is. And in the framework of Napoleon Hill, this state is not accidental. It is earned. It is what happens when thought, belief, and behavior have been repeated in alignment long enough to create a new frequency of being. That frequency doesn't just change how you act. It changes how the world responds to you. You start to notice things others don't see. You begin to feel a sense of timing, of intuition, of rhythm that seems invisible to those still trapped in cycles of doubt. Hill refers to this phenomenon as the activation of the sixth sense, a faculty of higher perception that only awakens when persistence becomes your nature and not your effort. But what does that really mean? It means your persistence has built you into a vessel strong enough to carry vision without breaking. And now the very act of continuing becomes a form of intelligence. Not academic intelligence, but spiritual intelligence. You no longer move because you're chasing something. You move because you are the movement. Your mission has become cellular, and this is the space where opportunity doesn't just appear, it gravitates. Hill was clear about this. Definiteness of purpose, when backed by unwavering persistence, causes the environment to bend, not by magic, but by principle. Because the world is wired to respond to clarity. And when that clarity is backed by endurance, it creates pressure, not the kind that crushes, but the kind that shapes. That's what your persistence does. It creates gravitational pressure. Eventually, results have no choice but to manifest. But even now, a warning echoes through Hill's philosophy. Do not become casual with this power. Do not allow the progress you've earned to seduce you into relaxation, because the very success that your persistence built can become the comfort that ends it. You must remain alert, not paranoid, but principled. Keep your eyes on the standard, not the scoreboard. Because the scoreboard fluctuates, the standard must remain sacred. That's why Hill advocates for constant self-assessment, not from guilt, but from mastery. The persistent mind is a mind that reflects, that questions its own consistency, that asks each day, did I act in alignment with who I claim to be? That question keeps the fire alive. It prevents drift. It protects identity. And speaking of identity, by this point in your journey, something irreversible has happened to yours. You no longer see yourself as someone who tries. That word is gone. You are someone who executes, and that execution doesn't depend on perfect conditions. It flows from an internal command that is stronger than mood, weather, criticism, or praise. You've also begun to notice that your energy is different, cleaner, more focused, less scattered. Because when you persist long enough, the unnecessary begins to fall away. You no longer waste time on decisions that don't matter. You no longer seek approval from those who haven't earned the right to influence you. Your vision becomes your only advisor, and your actions become your only argument. Hill emphasized that successful men and women were rarely the most charismatic, the most educated, or the most talented. But they moved forward relentlessly. They never allowed the appearance of failure to stop the machinery of effort. That effort, compounded over time, created what the world calls luck. But to Hill, and to you now, it's not luck. It's the inevitable consequence of disciplined continuation. And that discipline is no longer a struggle. It is your edge. It is what distinguishes you in a world addicted to comfort and reaction. You are no longer reactive. You are responsive. You move based on intention, and you no longer rush. Because when persistence is your foundation, patience becomes your weapon. You don't chase results anymore. You command them over time, with rhythm, with structure, with the quiet power of someone who has already decided. And that decision, reinforced by daily repetition, has now become your safety. Not in a way that makes you soft, but in a way that makes you indestructible. Because even when you fall, you rise the same way you always do, through motion, through forward pressure, through the relentless refusal to retreat. This is the heartbeat of Hill's philosophy. Not speed, not glamour, but the slow, steady pulse of someone who keeps going, who doesn't flinch, who doesn't quit, who acts, refines, and acts again. And over time, this rhythm becomes not only your power, but your peace, because nothing is more calming than knowing you are no longer controlled by hesitation. Nothing is more empowering than knowing you no longer rely on mood to move. Nothing is more fulfilling than waking up each day with the clarity that you will continue, regardless of what shows up on the outside. That is the state you've built, and that is the state that builds everything else. When persistence becomes your peace and rhythm replaces force, your relationship with time begins to transform. You stop racing the clock. You stop demanding instant results. You stop measuring your worth by the immediacy of outcomes. Because now you understand something deeper, something Hill repeats across every one of his major works. Time favors the disciplined. Time obeys the persistent. Time rewards those who move forward long enough to deserve acceleration. At this stage, your decisions carry weight because they're not made out of desperation. They're made out of alignment. You don't chase, you attract, not by sitting still, but by walking forward so consistently that the world adjusts to your presence. Your very movement becomes a frequency, and that frequency begins to summon the next level of your life. This is not theory. This is physics. This is psychology. This is Hill's law. And the most powerful aspect of this evolution is what happens in the absence of noise, when you no longer need drama to move, when you don't need stress to motivate, when chaos doesn't excite you anymore. This is where many collapse, because they've associated progress with adrenaline. But Hill shows you that the real power lies in calm repetition, in doing the work when it's boring, when it's quiet, when it's unrecognized. Because in that silence, the subconscious is most responsive. In that stillness, belief is most effectively planted. He refers to this as the space where autosuggestion becomes most potent. When your environment is minimal, your emotions are stable, and your actions are habitual. The words you speak to yourself begin to land with more force. You're no longer affirming from desperation, you're affirming from embodiment. You're reinforcing a self-image that has already been validated by weeks, months, or years of movement. And it is in this exact space, where nothing seems to be happening, that most people panic. They confuse quiet with regression. They mistake stability for stagnation. And so they sabotage, they self-interrupt, they manufacture problems. Why? Because they haven't yet developed the mental conditioning to trust the process. He whispers questions like, "Are you sure this is working? Or maybe you should try something new." And if your identity is not rooted in persistence, you'll follow those whispers. You'll abandon what's working for the illusion of something better. And in doing so, you'll restart the cycle of drift. But you know better now. You've outgrown that cycle. You've learned to see the stillness not as a void, but as a signal, a sign that your system is integrating, that your new self-image is being cemented, that the external is catching up with the internal, and instead of quitting, you double down. You do the same thing with more intensity, more clarity, more emotional investment, because that's how the tide turns. Hill emphasizes that the tipping point often comes after the last person would have quit. That's the test. That's the wall. That's the price of admission to the next level. And only the persistent cross that threshold. Not because they're lucky or gifted, but because they've trained themselves to continue without evidence. This is the essence of unshakable confidence. Not hype, not bravado, but the quiet knowing that your consistency is enough. That time is not your enemy, that progress is happening even when it's invisible, and that nothing, not fatigue, not failure, not fear, can outlast the version of you who refuses to stop. At this level, you begin to notice how much less reactive you are, how calm you stay under pressure, how detached you've become from the need for immediate validation. And that detachment is not apathy, it's power. It means your fuel is now internal. It means your results no longer control your behavior. You do, and as you live this way, you begin to access a deeper intelligence. You see patterns others miss. You hear insights in silence. You make decisions faster with more certainty because your mind is no longer clouded by the noise of emotional instability. This is what Hill meant by developing the higher faculties of the mind. Not just thinking, but knowing. Not just doing, but embodying. That's why at this point, persistence is no longer just action. It's atmosphere. It's the climate of your inner world. It's the tone of your thoughts, the cadence of your speech, the steadiness of your energy. And the longer you stay in that state, the more the world conforms. Not by chance, but by design. Because the world always conforms to the one who moves with certainty. So now the only question that remains is, will you remain faithful to this rhythm even when nothing around you demands it? Will you stay consistent when no one is watching, when no one is clapping, when no one is pushing? Because the next level of your life is not waiting on more inspiration. It's waiting on more consistency. It's waiting on you to prove, not once, but daily, that your decision to keep going was final. And once consistency is no longer dependent on willpower, when it flows from a place of identity, of alignment, of silent personal authority, you become something rare, something dangerous. You become inevitable, because at this point you are no longer competing, you are no longer chasing, you are no longer trying. You are simply being the kind of person whose existence generates progress. That shift is spiritual. It's the difference between effort and essence. Most people live in effort, constantly trying to push themselves to do what they promised. But when your behavior and your belief are integrated, when your decisions are made in advance and backed by persistent execution, the effort fades. All that remains is rhythm, precision, clean motion. This is the space where Hill's principles no longer feel like ideas, they feel like descriptions of your life. The law of auto-suggestion. It's what you live each morning as you speak your intentions aloud, knowing they are being planted deep into your subconscious, watered by your actions, and soon to blossom in results. The principle of definiteness of purpose. It's already coded into your daily rituals, into your time allocation, into your thought selection. The law of cosmic habit force? It's no longer theory. You see it in real time, in how fast your body obeys your commands, in how effortlessly you return to the path, even after minor interruptions. Your habits have become your structure, and your structure has become your power. This is what separates you from the masses. They still wait for a reason to act. You act as the reason. They still seek inspiration. You are inspiration, not in words, but in demonstration. And the most powerful part is this: you don't even need to be seen, because this identity you've built isn't dependent on praise, likes, or applause. It is sovereign, self-reinforcing, internal. And that's why it's so dangerous to everything that seeks to stop you, because there is no handle to pull you back. This level of mastery is not arrogant. It is humble, because it comes not from superiority, but from relentless service to your vision, to your discipline, to your future. Hill makes it clear: the greatest leaders, the ones who build empires, legacies, and revolutions, are not always loud. They are consistent, and that consistency is their legacy. Every day they wake up and execute with the same intensity, not because someone's watching, but because they are watching themselves. And so, your relationship with discomfort changes. You no longer resist it, you seek it, because you've trained your mind to associate pain with progress. Resistance is no longer a wall, it's a doorway. The heavier the emotion, the more you know you're close to the next level. You stop fearing the difficult days. You see them for what they are: proof that you're still moving forward, still alive, still dangerous. And as this identity deepens, your self-talk transforms. It no longer sounds like, "I hope I can," or "I'll try to," or "let's see what happens." It becomes, "I always do. I never stop. This is already mine," not from delusion, but from history, from pattern, from evidence you've earned. This is what gives your persistence its true weight. It's not stubbornness. It's not repetition for the sake of repetition. It is strategic, sacred, non-negotiable repetition for the sake of evolution. Hill reminds us that most people fail, not because they lack desire, but because they lack this structure. They make decisions in emotion and abandon them in difficulty. But you've inverted the formula. You make decisions in vision and maintain them through discipline. That's why you're still here. That's why you're still moving. That's why the setbacks haven't broken you. They've built you. And what once required conscious effort is now handled automatically. That's the genius of cosmic habit force. It turns character into reflex. You no longer have to hype yourself up. You move from programming that you installed. Through thought, through action, through daily acts of self-respect so small the world doesn't notice, but you do. And now, with every breath, you prove a truth that Hill hid in plain sight across all his teachings, that greatness is not in the finish line, it's in the man or woman who decides never to stop walking. By the time you've reached this point, when your actions have evolved from mere effort into instinct, from discipline into nature, a new type of confidence begins to emerge. Quiet, invisible, almost imperceptible from the outside, but internally unshakable. It's not the loud confidence of someone trying to convince the world they're strong. It's the deep, grounded knowing of someone who has walked through the fire of fatigue, distraction, and self-doubt, and kept going. And what fuels that? Knowing is not theory. It is evidence. Days stacked on days, decisions honored in silence, standards upheld when no one else is watching. Napoleon Hill knew this form of confidence was rare. That's why he associated it with those who possessed what he called personal initiative, the kind of proactive force that never waits for momentum, but creates it. At this stage, persistence is not just what you do, it's what you trust. You've built a relationship with your own movement, and that relationship is sacred. It carries you through mornings when your mind resists, through moments when doubt tries to re-enter, through seasons where results appear stagnant, but your spirit remains unwavering. And in that stability, there's a new kind of freedom. The freedom of predictability, of knowing that you can count on yourself regardless of mood or outcome. Because now, you are no longer working toward consistency. You are consistency. That is the real reward of persistence. Not just the success it produces, but the version of you it reveals. The version that doesn't need certainty to act, that doesn't need a good day to move, that doesn't collapse when plans fall through. Hill warned us repeatedly that most people are slaves to circumstances. Their emotional thermostat rises and falls with their environment. But the persistent man or woman is different. Their emotional temperature is set by decision, not situation, and that decision is reinforced every time they choose to act without needing a reason. You don't need a reason anymore. You don't need to feel right. You don't need to see proof, because you've redefined what proof means. Proof is the routine. Proof is the repetition. Proof is the unshakable rhythm of action that you've trained into your very biology. And because of that, you've earned something rare, peace without complacency. That's the paradox most never achieve. They either work hard and stay anxious, or they become calm and start to decay. But you live with calm intensity, focused stillness, the power to push without chaos, the ability to move without drama. Hill would call this mastery of self. It's the final unspoken law that governs everything else. Because once you've mastered yourself, you no longer need to control outcomes. You influence them. Your presence alters the dynamic. Your energy shifts the room, not because of what you say, but because of who you've become. And this is why your results begin to compound. Not just in scale, but in speed. Because the universe, your subconscious, and even your network begin to trust your rhythm. They see you coming before you arrive. They feel the frequency of someone who finishes, who moves, who never wavers. And in a world addicted to inconsistency, you become rare. You become irreplaceable. And most importantly, you become unstoppable. But with this power comes a question, a new kind of responsibility. Because now that you know you can persist through anything, what will you choose to build? What will you commit to with the full force of your conviction? Not just for a season, not just until you're tired, but for life. Hill always brought us back to purpose, because persistence without purpose becomes burnout. Action without vision becomes noise, and no matter how strong your habits become, they must remain tethered to a cause greater than comfort, greater than convenience, and greater than ego. You persist not just to win, but to serve. To prove to yourself and to the world that your life is not a reaction, it is a mission. And when you live like that, when every day is a reinforcement of the person you've chosen to be, fear loses its leverage. The unknown loses its mystery, because now the only unknown that matters is how far you'll go, not if you'll get there. The if is dead. The when is inevitable. So look at yourself today, not in the mirror, but in your behavior, in your momentum, in your ability to continue without applause, without reward, without permission. That is the real mirror. That is where identity reveals itself. And if you don't like what you see, you already know what to do. Persist again, with more clarity, with more urgency, with the memory of everything you've already survived, already pushed through, already proven. Because nothing you face from this point forward is stronger than the persistence you've built behind you. And nothing ahead of you is more powerful than the decision you've already made to never stop moving. By now, the word persistence is no longer just a principle, it's a presence. A presence that walks with you into every room, every project, every challenge. You don't need to announce it. People feel it. You don't need to prove it. Your consistency already has. You've crossed a line that most never even approach. The line where stopping no longer feels like an option, not because of ego, not because of pressure, but because of alignment. Because everything in you, your mind, your habits, your emotional patterns, your subconscious code, has accepted one truth. We keep going, no matter what. Napoleon Hill said that persistence is the one quality without which no other will do. Intelligence without persistence becomes wasted potential. Talent without persistence becomes unrealized dreams. Even faith without persistence becomes powerless. Because persistence is what gives all other traits their expression in the world. It is the mechanism by which invisible thought becomes visible reality. And you now live as that mechanism. This doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're predictable. Predictable in your response to fear, predictable in your response to fatigue, predictable in your response to setbacks. Your life is no longer reactive. It's structured. You're not guessing anymore, you're executing, not because it's easy, but because you've made it inevitable. And here's what's even more powerful. Your persistence has become contagious. The people around you feel your standard. They start to raise theirs, not because you preach at them, but because you live in a way that exposes their excuses. And that is leadership, not charisma, not control, consistency, the decision to walk the talk when no one else does. Hill taught us that the greatest movements in history didn't start with noise. They started with quiet people who moved with clarity day after day until the world had to pay attention. That's you now. You don't need to scream. You continue. You don't need to impress, you execute. And that is why your life will never look the same again. And if the path still feels heavy at times, good. That means it matters. That means you're still on it. That means you haven't outsourced your calling to comfort. So when those moments of pressure arrive, don't ask, how long will this take? Ask instead, how far am I willing to go? How long am I willing to persist? What am I willing to endure in order to become who I said I'd be? Because the answer to those questions will determine everything else, not just your results, but your respect. Not just your outcomes, but your identity. So today, make the most important decision of your life. Decide that you will never again retreat into inaction. That from this moment forward, the rhythm of your movement will be louder than the noise of your doubts. That persistence is not a phase, it is who you are now. And if this video reminded you of your power, share it. Send it to 3 people who need to hear this message. Not to motivate them, but to challenge them, to say, I'm holding this standard. You with me? Then drop your response below. What is one thing you refuse to quit on, no matter how long it takes? Say it out, loud. Write it, declare it, because persistence is not passive. It is a declaration. And today, you just made yours.